Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and answering your questions tonight, Internet entrepreneur Ruslan Kogan, Greens leader Christine Milne, the Minister for Workplace Relations Bill Shorten, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition Julie Bishop and former Doug Anthony All-Star comedian and now Senate candidate Tim Ferguson. Please welcome our panel. Q&A is live from 9:35 Eastern Daylight Saving Time. You can join the Twitter conversation using the hashtag on your screen. Our first question tonight comes from Wendy Tucker.
Hi, my question's for Minister Shorten. The government slashed up to $120 per week from top-up payments to sole parents, giving less than 5 weeks' notice for the changes to take effect. If your aim is to get us into the workforce, why is it that the parents who are actually working and studying stand to lose the most? I would have thought it beneficial to the government to actually help get sole parents into the skilled marketplace. Are we simply the easiest to take down?
Bill Shorten.
Wendy, in terms of the changes which have been made, first of all, let me say that I think it is very difficult for anyone to survive on Newstart. In terms of sole parents, there are a range of supports which are available. Some of the changes which we've made also include giving you more access to childcare than you previously would have had. In terms of the specific point you made about study, I understand that some of the changes which have been talked about with study haven't actually occurred, so I'd be more than pleased to talk with you after the show about the particular circumstances you're talking about. We believe in our government...
Are you saying you might be able to reverse this decision?
No, I'm saying I'm happy to talk to the person about her particular issues. Also, what I'd say more generally is that the government believes that the best chance to break the cycle of poverty is to help people get work. That's why we've spent a record amount in terms of helping people find work, but I don't pretend any of this stuff's easy at all.
Just very briefly, I'll bring you in a moment, Christine. The UN said today that these welfare cuts for single mums could have a detrimental effect on their human rights. Do you take that kind of criticism seriously?
Yes. I haven't read the report yet, but I'm aware of its release today, and I do take, well, potentially, without having read it, but I take the point very seriously, so I will be studying it. And
responding to the UN?
Oh, I'll be studying the report for sure.
Christine
See
Milne.
what it suggests.
Well, the United Nations report actually confirms everything that the single parents have been talking to the Greens about, and that is you don't get people out of poverty and you don't get them into work by taking away the payments that enable them to actually stay in the workforce or get into the workforce. It was a bad decision, and it's appalling when you think that the miners only paid $126 million in tax and the government took more out of the pockets of single parents than you've had from the big miners, and you've got Marius Kloppers walking away with $75 million. It's just not fair, it's not just, and it should be reversed.
We've got a hand up over there. We'll get a microphone to you, but in the meantime, let's hear from Julie Bishop.
There's clearly a balance to be struck between supporting single parents and encouraging people back into the workforce. And when the government came up with this proposal, I assumed that they were aware of their international obligations under the UN and human rights laws, and I assume they had the evidence to support the proposal. It was put forward as a savings measure, and given that the government has spent about $170 billion more than has come in revenue over the last 4 years, it's very difficult to oppose a savings measure. But I'm interested that Bill is prepared to meet with you and discuss how it's impacting on you, and I think that's what we need to hear, and thank you for asking the question.
Quickly go to that question on the floor there.
I'm a single parent too. I have 2 autistic kids. Even these teeth come from labour. I had cancer because of the stress of raising autistic kids under the Howard government, under Abbott as Health Minister. I've had such a difference to my life because of labour. I'm better off because casual work and raised tax thresholds mean I actually can go to work. But basically, even this hair comes from labour. It's a labour makeover. And I loathe Abbott. I loathe him deeply.
Okay, I think we can take that as a comment. I'll get, Tim Ferguson wants to jump in. Go ahead.
Just a second here. We've heard from the three politicians. Frankly, it's a mirage what you people are talking about. You're talking about a behavioural initiative to change the behaviour of a single parent trying to raise children. Now, what's best for children? The best thing for children is to have a parent at home who takes care of them, not one who's pushed out into work simply by poverty. Are you people all crazy? Do you respond to that? It's not a saving because those kids will grow up in poverty. And what are they going to do?
I think it is important to have parents at home with kids, so I'm not going to argue, Tim, with that point. But what I also think is important is that people have the opportunity to work. Now, what I've said, listening to Wendy's point, is that she'll have a set of circumstances, she'll have a set of arrangements, and I'm interested to work through the issues. But what I also think is that when we give up trying to help encourage people into work, well, then we're giving up on people altogether. And so I agree with what you say about parenting and kids and the time, but this is a challenge which working parents have all the time as well. But I also think that we've got to be careful of not giving up on trying to do something about the cycle of long-term unemployment, because if kids never get to see their parents working, that can also pay a cost down the track in the future. So I don't think it's a case of trying to race to say, well, one is more pure than the other. And I just think we've got to make sure that as changes occur, that people don't get squashed. And that's Wendy's point, so that's why I'm interested to talk it through with you. I
want to come to Rosalind Cogan in a moment. Just, Minister, just a moment still with you. You said it's extremely difficult to live or survive on the New Start allowance. So how do people do it?
I imagine with great difficulty. The amount is, when you add on bits and pieces, very small. And so, yeah, it would be difficult.
So why aren't you increasing it $50 a week, as all the charities, the Business Council, virtually everyone who looks at New Start recognises it's not enough, and to bring the single parents back onto that is actually driving them into poverty. I mean, Tim's point is, yes, it can be at home, but how can they actually feed their families? How can they actually train and do things they want to do on that amount of money? They can't. And that's why it is wrong that we are not fixing the mining tax so that we don't get the money to be able to support people in the way that we should. That's the key thing. We've got to raise the revenue.
Let's just go back to original questioner Wendy Tucker. What would you like to say to the Minister? He's offered a conversation with you. Do you want to start it now?
I'd just basically like to say to him, I mean, I've worked the whole way through since I took 3 months off when she was born. I've got a great employer. He's afforded me to be able to do casual things around, you know, school assemblies and sick days and things. But I only just went to 3 days a week a year ago to get certified, Certificate 4 in Financial Services Accounting, because my boss is going to retire. So now that I'm down to 3 days a week work and 2 days study, I can't survive on this. I'm losing $170 a fortnight, and the thing is I lost it with 5 weeks' notice. I got told at the end of November that, bang, the 1st of January, that's when I lose this money. Now, it's absurd. There was no childcare open on the 1st of January. Christmas time, my brother bought her Christmas presents. I come back to school, I had to have a meeting with the principal last week. She was in school band, $100 a term, I can't afford that now. I've dropped out of that this term. I had to apologise because I can't afford the school fees. I've got Rego coming up in 3 weeks. I don't know what, you know, $350 a week rent on my own, and I've worked the maximum I can. You know, I've worked 5 days a week, 2 nights a week while she was young, taking her to a restaurant, working at night time. I have to stop that because I need to get a higher hourly rate. Now, because of this, I will not be able to finish my studies in the time allocated. I'm going to have to work as much as I possibly can and still scrape through.
Thank you very much. Bill Shorten, was the government too harsh?
Tony, I'm going to actually go to
Wendy's. Like this?
I'm going to go to Wendy's circumstances. First of all, the decision was made in the budget, so it frustrates me no end to hear that you heard about it 5 weeks before the decision. The second thing is, in your set of circumstances, like, I'm interested to see what can be done, because what you say and the conviction with which you say it frustrates me that you're in this circumstance. So we'll just have to work it through and see what can be done. I cannot believe a woman as inspirational as you presented then, that we can't, that this system is so stupid that it can't help alleviate your concerns.
See, I'm one of the lucky ones.
Yeah, we'll work it through.
I can't believe it. I've got it. Russell and Kogan, would you be happy as a businessman to pay extra taxes to support single mums as they try and enter the workforce in a more inclusive way?
Look, I don't know enough details on the certain situations because I'm not a parent myself, let alone a single parent. I'll pay whatever taxes the government tells me to pay all the time, but you know, one thing that I'm not is I'm the only person on this panel that's not media trained. I can't think one thing and say another and look at you guys with a straight face. So, what you get out of me is WYSIWYG, and for the non-IT geeks out there, means what you see is what you get.
So briefly, what do you think?
I'm not a parent. I can't give you. I can pretend to think. I have ultimate respect for parents and the hardships they go through. I watch my parents come here with $90 in their pocket, work 3 jobs each while trying to raise kids and study at the same time. And you know, I can't even imagine how hard that was for them. I'm not a father, and let alone a single parent. And you know, that was a moving story. And I hope that our government's doing all the right things to help people like that.
Okay, let's move on. We've got quite a few issues to cover tonight. Our next question is from Aaron Cowper.
Minister Bishop, a recent survey by the National Union of Students found that more than 1 in 10 female university student respondents have experienced rape or attempted rape on campus. So why then, based on a single alleged incident, did the opposition vilify asylum seekers and reduce them to the status of convicted pedophiles, rather than propose effective measures to protect vulnerable women on campus? And why can't you call it what it really is, and appeal to underlying racist sentiment in Australia at the beginning of an election campaign?
Julie Bishop.
First, let me clear up one thing. We didn't compare asylum seekers to pedophiles. It was in response to a request from a reporter who linked it. But we must recall that under the government's mandatory detention system, which was introduced by Labor, which was supported by the Coalition, people who come to Australia by boat and claim asylum are put into mandatory detention so that their identity and background and security checks can be done. Because the government is overwhelmed now with the number of people arriving, the detention network system has broken down, and people are now being released into the community and not kept in detention before the background checks, the identity checks and the security checks are completed. Now, in the instance we're talking about, people have been put into, it seems, accommodation in the community that is entirely unacceptable. And the government isn't taking any responsibility for the fact that a large number of people have been moved into the community, into accommodation that the government doesn't even know about. They didn't know that they were in student accommodation at a university. They didn't know that they were in unused office buildings, living in squalor in Parramatta. And Scott Morrison asked the question, shouldn't the people in that accommodation have been told that large numbers of people were being moved in?
Scott Morrison also wants to impose behavioural protocols on asylum seekers. What are behavioural protocols? Do you know?
What he was referring to was the fact that the government's just making this up as they go along. The policy has been clearly a failure. Ever since Labor changed the laws that had stopped the boats coming and stopped people taking that terrible journey to Australia, about 1,000 people are said to have died in recent years on that journey.
OK, but if you can come to my question, what are behavioural protocols? Because no one's explained this yet, and yet he's talking about them.
The government is clearly just making it up as they go along. People were in a system of mandatory detention. They're now out on bridging visas, and there's no information surrounding those bridging visas. And we've got large numbers of people being moved into the community, and the government's not taking any responsibility for them. So we're rightly asking the questions that the Parramatta Council asked. Why weren't they told that
but
people were moving in?
But hang on a sec, what are behavioural protocols?
That's the sort of thing I'm referring to.
Well, no, you haven't referred to it yet. What are behavioural protocols?
Telling the Parramatta Council, for example, that a large number of people are going to be moving into accommodation. In this case, it was...
as I understand it, behavioural protocols... Just, sorry, 1 second. Behavioural protocols are to be imposed upon the people themselves, the asylum seekers. So the question is, what are they?
Well, I believe he was talking about reporting requirements.
Well, he's talking about that as well as behavioural protocols
Well, I
imposed
see,
on the actual asylum
I see
seekers.
it as a reporting requirement.
Right, okay.
But
So
also,
no actual imposition on individual asylum seekers.
But also, I think the point that the university students have made is a fair one, and that is that if you are paying to stay in university accommodation as a university student, I think you're entitled to know if people who aren't uni students are being moved in by the government. You're entitled to know that.
Why?
And well, I would want to know if I was a university student and I was paying to stay in student accommodation, presumably with students. I'd want to know if all of a sudden there were people that weren't students who were there, or if there were a lot of mine workers from the Pilbara. I'd want to know why are they here. And I think you should be
You
told.
want to know who you can copy and who you can't copy.
No, I'm just saying. I think it's a fair enough question to ask. Why weren't people told?
Well, there are more federal parliamentarians who've been arrested for something or charged with something than asylum seekers in the last 3 years. So should they all have to have behavioural protocols?
Can I say, just before that, does anyone on this panel actually know what behavioural protocols are?
And it's not right to say that it's the reporting requirements. There are already reporting requirements in place. That's part of community detention and community processes. So that's not what it means. Look, let's face it, it was a dog whistle. We all saw it as a dog whistle. It was a dog whistle, and now there's revisionism about what is being said.
Christine, I'm shocked by the stat you just mentioned. Can you tell me where you got it from?
By the state.
You said that the stat. You said that there's been more politicians arrested than asylum seekers.
Yes, because in fact there's about 40 to 45 times less likely for someone seeking asylum than other people in the community to be involved in crime.
97.4% of people make up their own statistics. I said, where did it come from?
Yeah, well, it's...
And that was one of them or not?
I want to have a go at behavioural protocol.
All right, OK. Bill Shorten.
I'll have a go at what the Libs meant by behavioural protocols. There are votes in bagging asylum seekers. There are votes in saying a class of people we need to be suspicious about. They need to... just because you come here by a leaky boat and you're put out into the community does not mean as a general category of person that you should be subjected to a higher standard than the rest of Australians. Right. We need to be very careful with the politics of fear when it says that one category of people, because of the circumstances in which they arrive here, or indeed any other category, because does it stop at asylum seekers who come here by boat if they're in the community? What if one day the Libs say, well, we want all building workers who might be delegates of a union to be under a behavioural protocol? What if it's a group of migrants from a particular background because they have a different religion? Behavioural protocols being spoken by the Libs is at best loose language designed to catch up a few people who are suspicious of people who look different to the rest of us, and at worst it's a calculated attempt to inflame people's concern about asylum seekers. So behavioural protocol is code for fear.
Bill, under your own policy of mandatory detention, such people would still be in detention until such time as their security and identity checks were completed. Had you not lost control of border protection, had you not lost control of the detention network, these people wouldn't have been out on bridging visas, and so we wouldn't even be having this discussion. And I think we should be very careful as we have this discussion to remember that a young woman has claimed to have been sexually assaulted, and she's obviously suffering some trauma. So before we go demonising other people, including politicians, remember that this is a sensitive issue for a young woman. But also, under your policy, people are in mandatory detention until such time as these checks are completed. And only because the detention network has been overwhelmed by your failings.
Julie, it's only because Scott Morrison pushed too far that smart people like you are having to backtrack and defend what was really a comment beyond the limit. Yes. The only reason we're having this debate is because some elements of the Liberal Party thinks there's votes in scaring people about boat people. Let's call it as it is. And at least that's one thing about Q&A. The government may, get a bit of free advice from people, which is fair enough. But at last, there's one show in Australia where you can actually call it for what it is. It's fear-mongering stuff.
Don't lecture us.
Enough is enough.
Ruslan Kogan was talking about... I'll go to either end of the panel. First of all, Ruslan Kogan. So I'd like to hear what you think about the question.
from my end, I don't know the inner details and what was going on behind the scenes and all of that. All I know is that Australia is the best country in the world. There's no wonder so many people are trying to come here. But I think that, you know, we also need to ensure that if people do come here, they come here to become Australians and to take on our values and to adhere to our rule of law, to adhere to property rights, to adhere to women's rights and to become Australians. When my parents immigrated here, we didn't come, we came here to be Australians. We didn't come here from communist Russia to bring communism to Australia. So I think whatever is in place, it needs to ensure that people adhere to our values and our way of life and our laws.
Tim Ferguson.
Scott Morrison has only gone for this absurdly, I think, offensive measure on the right because it's the only room left. Julia Gillard and your government, Bill, have taken up all the right-wing room, and all Scott has, poor darling, is he's just got to leap off into the dark saying, well, we should give them behavioural protocols that aren't just Nauru, which has been reopened, that aren't just all of the barbed wire we put around the children. We need to write down a little list to codify, don't spit on the sidewalk. You haven't left the Liberals anywhere to move to get the right-wing vote.
No one made the Liberals say their stuff. That was all their own work.
And Julie Bishop, just one quick question before we leave this subject. Was Scott Morrison off-piste here, or did he actually run this past the shadow cabinet?
Scott Morrison was interviewed about the matter. He spoke quite reasonably about it, in my view.
But was that the first time you heard about behavioural protocols, the informing of neighbourhoods, all that sort of stuff?
This is the first time this circumstance has arisen. I didn't know.
It wasn't passed through shadow cabinet as a policy.
Tony, I didn't know that there were people on bridging visas living in squalid conditions in Parramatta, and the government didn't know.
So,
I didn't know
seriously,
that the government didn't know
are you saying
about
that he made it up as he went along because he was shocked by what he heard?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we were responding to a circumstance that we hadn't realised had got so bad, that the government had lost control of the whole detention network.
I'm just curious, was it a Scott Morrison frolic? Or was it its decision?
Let's start focusing on the real issue and stop trying to demonise Scott Morrison, and let's look at what's actually happened here. What's actually happened here?
Well, Scott, as opposed to everyone else who's been demonised. Let Scott be free,
The government wants to push responsibility onto everybody else for its own policy failings. I would say the government's failings in border protection and in this area are the greatest of this generation. It has utterly walked away from responsibility to protect borders, to stop people getting on boats. And don't forget, when the Howard government left office, there were 4 people who had arrived by boat in the detention network. Now 35,000 have come under extraordinarily dangerous circumstances, and the government have no answers and no solutions. So we're responding to these. Thank you, Roslyn. We're responding to the circumstances as they unfold, and I think people would be shocked to know that the government's put people on bridging visas, put them out into the community, and have got no idea of the circumstances in which they're living.
Yes, they do.
Okay.
No, that's not right.
I think we've covered this area quite a bit. Let's move along. Our next question comes from Graham McTeague.
Our government's too quick, both state and federally, to put strong emphasis on crime rather than social and infrastructure programs and provide better employment opportunities in the West. Are we painting really a picture of despair for the youth in that area and division by pitching all our arguments about law and order in the current campaigns that are rolling out?
Christine Milne, let's start with you.
Yeah, look, I think the focus should be on education and opportunity. A lot's been said about the 457 visas. The Prime Minister has come out and used the word foreigner in relation to 457s to say Australians first. And the point is, the best way to get Australians into jobs is to provide a good education system, the TAFE system, further education all round, and a living wage for apprentices. If you start going in that direction, then you start getting people up to the skills base so that you don't need to bring in people from other places to fill those skills gaps. But the other thing in Western Sydney that's so desperately needed is public transport. Every city that overcomes congestion and becomes competitive and has better amenity actually puts in a decent public transport system. And Parramatta Light Rail is something the council out there supports, the community supports. We need to be putting money into public infrastructure, green corridors, higher levels of education and opportunity for young people. That's the way we need to proceed. And in terms of gang violence or guns, the best way of dealing that is to ban semi-automatic handguns, but right across the community, not just in New South Wales, but the whole country.
Bill Shorten, let's hear from you. I mean, Julie Gillard literally went gangbusters over the weekend when she put together a task force of... you like that one?
Yeah, it was good.
70...
Did you write that yourself?
I thought about it myself.
Good.
70 police in this national task force. I suspect that's part of what the question is getting at there. Was it really necessary? Is it really necessary to have a law and order campaign?
Well, going to your point and also Graham's point about what are the most important priorities, again, it's worth just restating that this is a government who has spent more money on the infrastructure of schools in Western Sydney, indeed all of Australia, for the building education revolution. Despite all the negative carping, most parents, including myself, at most schools and most teachers are rapt at the new infrastructure. So we've spent money on that. There are trade training centres which weren't there before Labor was elected, which are there now. There's more spots in higher education than there were before Labor was elected. And something as fundamental as childcare, the rebate's gone up. So I believe that when you look at the list of what Labor's done, which you won't always read in every newspaper, there's a lot going on in the things which you think are very important. In terms of infrastructure, I mean, there's something as important as having a national broadband network which allows small business to, you know, compete online, to have a go. We've been doing a lot in infrastructure. We've spent 10 times the amount on rail that the Howard government had spent. So there has been a lot of work in those areas you think are important. But in terms of gangs, they are an issue. The Prime Minister has made that an announcement. There's been plenty of coverage about issues to do with guns and violence. But I would say to you, to reassure you, that if you look at the full sweep of what this government's been doing, it's been spending billions on education, it's been spending billions in training, it's been spending billions in infrastructure, and we're seeing the outcomes now happening, and we're seeing kids with the best chance in life.
Julie Bishop, Tony Abbott's now saying he's not only going to stop the boats, he's going to stop the guns as well. Are you going to keep the task force?
Law and order is usually a state issue, and I can understand why federal Labor doesn't want to talk about federal issues and they're now focusing on state issues. But where the federal government can act, it should. And it was the Howard government that introduced the most comprehensive gun laws after the tragedy at Port Arthur. And that was a positive move that I think most people applauded as being a policy that really did make a difference. Of course, we can go further, and Christine raised a very valid point about semi-automatic weapons in the community. But what troubles me about the Prime Minister's announcement is that while she's talking about tackling crime at a federal level, there were budget cuts to the Australian Federal Police, to Customs and to our intelligence services. So our frontline services that are funded at federal level have actually been cut under Labor's budget. So there's this inconsistency in the message between being tough on crime and yet cutting the budget from those agencies that are...
So briefly, would you keep the task force or put the money back into Customs?
We're of course going to support anything that makes a difference, but we'll have a look at how effective it would be. We are determined to try and put the funding back into the frontline services when the budget's in a position to do so, or when we can find the savings in areas where it won't affect frontline activity.
Tony, just when Julie said that Labor's cut, law and order.
I said funding to the agencies.
Okay, well, Tony Negus, who's the head of the AFP, says that in his time, which is the time which Labor's been in, there are more federal police on the front line than there have been. So there's always two sides to every story.
Bill, did you cut the budget to the AFP? Yes.
So he doesn't know what he's talking about.
It's different
Tim
question.
Ferguson.
Public transport, I think, Christine, you mentioned, I mean, all of you have mentioned public transport as being important to give young people the facility, the agency to go places, to do something apart from hang around their neighbourhood. This would be great, except for the fact that just in Melbourne alone, I think it costs basically $4, maybe $3 for a teenager to go from an outer suburb to an inner suburb. The further out they live, the more it costs. So why would they travel anywhere if they wanted to do it every day? You're talking 40, 50, 60 bucks for one kid to get into the city to try something else at life. We have to tell these corporations that run these state transport systems, thanks very much, we'll pay the bill. I can't see why we have so many people jumping on trams going, hot, 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 stop it, silence, hold still, you, have you got a ticket? I'm not going to pay for a ticket if someone's going to shout at me for it. I think we should have free public transport so it is public transport, and then the young people might just try other things in life.
Ruslan Kogan.
I'm honestly, Tony, I'm sitting here so confused. I'm nowhere near well media trained enough to follow what just happened. So we had a question about violence and, you know, upkeeping the law. Then we went on to schools and shotguns and cost of private and cost of public transport to healthcare to. I'm struggling.
You
to
can
follow.
bring it back to the question if you so wish.
To the question, yeah, I think that, you know, you need to enforce the law. That is a principle or a foundation of our society. I think at all costs, the question was around taking focus away from that to society. You can never take focus away from enforcing the law. I think that that's a principle on which our society was built, and we need to know that the laws are in place and will be enforced.
OK, let's move on to a different subject. Our next question comes from Jordana Smith, who's speaking through a sign language interpreter.
The Employment Assistance Fund, it's to help people who have a disability in the workplace, but the funding is strictly limited. For example, sign language interpreters are capped at $6,000 a year, which is enough for 6 full days at work. That doesn't cover meetings and training. So what happens after that is that we miss out. Do you have any plans to increase funding to access to employment for deaf people?
Bill Shorten.
That's a pretty good question. In terms of the Employment Assistance Fund, we think, and I certainly believe, that just because someone's got a disability doesn't mean that they should be put in a different pile and not given the chance to be employed. I'll take on board the suggestion about the restrictions on assistance for AusSign or people who do sign language in terms of training. But beyond that, so I'll take that on board. That's just a good point. You can't argue with that.
Would you be prepared to consider increasing the funding? Because that's the key question there. The funding is capped at $6,000, it said, which is enough for just 6 days. Now, 6 days in the course of a year, if you're trying to get a job, not very much.
This may or may not pass the Ruslan test, but the answer is yes, I think it's a good point. So I will take it on board. But beyond that, disability employment generally, the unemployment rates for people with disabilities is still ridiculous in Australia. By ridiculous, what I mean is that there's still, I don't think it's conscious discrimination, but there's a lot of unconscious prejudice. Because people present differently, they don't get the same chances. I probably also think it's time that, working with Australian companies, that if you employ more than 100 people, those companies could report the number of people with disabilities annually that they employ. Because I think there's a lot of people who think that it's too hard to employ people with disabilities, whereas I actually just think it's that people are unfamiliar with the system, and that given changes in adaptive technology, like there's a whole lot of Australians who, if we get smart, could go to work. So the access to signing's one thing, but I also think we just need to get a lot of companies saying that not everyone we hire has to look like us.
Are you talking about a mandatory reporting system for all companies, reporting how many people with disabilities they're employing?
Yeah, it's not government policy, but it's my view. Something's got to change. You can't just keep doing things the same way and then expect a different outcome. I think that it's not a case that you set quotas, but I do think it's a case that it's probably time. In Australia, it would be once a year in your annual report. It's just not that hard.
Is it sort of shaming companies into doing better, or just getting more transparency around this?
It's not even shaming, because I'm not saying, it's just getting people to think about it. You look at a lot of companies hire people through search agencies, and I just think that there's a lot of filters between the person with the impairment getting to the interview and getting to the job, and all of us can do it smarter. The public sector the federal public sector is committed to do more, but anyway, I just think it's a no-brainer. Disability employment, big area disadvantage, and for not a lot of effort, we can unlock a whole lot of productive people who are currently just not on the radar.
I'll hear from both the other politicians. Julie Bishop first.
I am aware of a number of very good programs in my state of Western Australia through disability services to encourage employers to take on people with disabilities, and I've certainly seen some great results from those sorts of programs. At a federal level, I'm interested to hear about the cap. I hadn't appreciated that there was a $6,000 cap that translated into 6 days of Auslan or interpreting services. And I'd be very keen to know, as I'm sure Bill would be, as to how many people would actually benefit greatly from an increase in the ability to access those services, and how their chances or opportunities of getting a job or remaining in work are being hampered by not having at least 6 days. So I think that would be a very interesting piece of evidence for us to all learn about.
What do you think about the mandatory reporting idea that has just been raised here?
I'm really not keen on government mandating small business to take on even more
let's say
red
100
tape
employees and above.
Well, that's still a small business in some instances. I'm just not keen on government mandating more red tape, more regulation on small business. After all, we should be encouraging small business to make it easier for them to employ people, not harder. And so I'm sure we can be more creative about encouraging businesses to be aware of the great talent, skill and capabilities that people who have a disability can bring.
Okay, we've got a hand up in the front there. We'll just quickly go to that.
I'd just like to ask if there's the possibility of the government leading by example and employing a lot of these people with disabilities.
Yeah.
And even in addition to that, making it more public about the benefits of recruiting persons with a disability, about diversity in the workplace, etc.
Now we'll get a very brief answer from Bill Shorten on that. Very brief, if you don't mind.
The Australian Public Sector Commission has recently announced a new plan to employ more people with disabilities. There's a lot of good success stories out there in small and medium-sized business, but just before Conservatives chip the idea of saying, oh, it's more red tape for companies, if you keep doing things the same way and simply hope that something will change, well, then what we're doing is we're consigning the same people to the same poor outcomes. I don't think it's a big leap just to simply once a year get companies thinking, actually, how many people with a disability do we employ? The public service does it. I just don't think it's the big leap of red tape which Julie was characterising it as.
If that were the only regulation you were imposing on small business, I'd say fine. But we don't want to burden business to the point where they don't employ people. We want to make it easier for
on this
people to
subject, before I come to you, Christine, we've got a tweet from Janet backstage. Mr. Kogan, you have a big business. Will you offer a job to someone with a disability?
Yeah, certainly. Look, you know, in terms of my company, it's all a meritocracy. So all of our staff are remunerated based on the value they add to the business. There's some staff that have had multiple pay rises every year. We pay very high wages. We do our best to try and attract the best. Now, if someone has a disability but they can still perform a certain task very well, we have absolutely no issue employing them to perform that task. So, you know, if someone, for instance, like we just saw ask the question, they could be fine at typing emails and replying to people by email. There's absolutely no issue there. So we would be more than happy to employ those people, and that's how our company operates. It's a meritocracy.
Christine Milne.
Well, I think it's a terrific proposal to employ more people with disabilities, but I go back to we're hearing from both the Coalition and Labor that they think it's a good idea, but I come back to the fact, yes, it is a great idea, but when are they going to say where the money's going to come from? Because everybody knows that there are students in our schools at the moment who are disabled, and schools are trying to get volunteers to come in to help those kids because there is not the money to pay for carers, to pay for the assistants, to pay for everything that needs to happen. And so what's happening is people with disabilities are being pushed to one side because governments are not making the money available to support them through the system, or to actually assist in businesses to take them on. And the assistance you've mentioned is one of those things. But my point is, so much is being promised at the moment. We've already had Bill talking a minute ago about how he'll review the single parents pension after having taken it away. We know that they need to increase Newstart. We know carers need more. We know people with disabilities need to be supported. What that means is we have to get serious about talking about who can afford to pay more so that we can support people in the way that we need to.
Okay,
and that's why the Greens are saying let's raise that money.
A brief response. We will be coming to this question in more detail, so a brief response.
Just before we dismiss, from either, Labor's got to do something. On this issue of the employment, I'm not saying it costs a lot to change people's attitudes. What I am suggesting is that if we look at people with impairment differently, and if we stop just looking at their appearance or a particular attribute and look at the whole person, that doesn't actually cost a lot of subsidy. It just means that we have to change the way people look at people with disabilities. And let's not kill a good idea, Christine, I'm just saying on some sort of point score on the money. This one is a cheap way.
It's not a point score.
I beg your pardon, all right, not a point score, but it's a cheap way. This is a cheap way to help a lot of people out, which is saying employ more people with disabilities.
Tim Ferguson.
I think it's great.
So, Tim Ferguson.
Tony, just while we're on that, I was at a recruiting conference and a woman came to me and said, look, I've got this 18-year-old boy, he's got spinal bifida, he's having a hell of a time getting a job. I have a hell of a time explaining to employees that, he wants to work. What should I say? And I said, well, I don't know all that much about the condition, but I'm betting that of the list of difficult things in that guy's day, answering the phones would be right down the bottom.
That's right.
Good point.
We've got a web question actually for you, Tim. It's from Bernie O'Shannessy in Werribee, Victoria. As a person who also uses a big stick, I've found those who have to deal with impairment every day are some of the funniest people I know. Do you feel a sense of humour is a shield or a weapon when dealing with disability?
Don't push me, Tony. Yes, I do a show called Carry a Big Stick because I carry a big stick. I think a sense of humour is very important. People find it very difficult around people with a disability because, they feel uncomfortable, probably because they feel so bloody lucky. But it certainly helps get through the day having a laugh at this thing. I've got multiple sclerosis, which is highly unpredictable and is a little bit scary, and that's the nature of comedy. Scary things that are highly unpredictable. Yeah, you nearly jumped there. And we can both do a death stare. Come on, Jill, let's do a death stare.
OK, watching Q&A. Remember, you can send your web or video questions to our website. The address is on the screen. Our next question is a video. It's from James Harrison in Toorak, Victoria.
My question is to Julie Bishop. Your leader, Tony Abbott, has continually questioned the validity of credible scientists from around the world who present us with compelling evidence that climate change is happening and that the overwhelmingly likely cause is human pollution. Right now, Australia is experiencing more extreme weather events like bushfires, floods and cyclones. Right now, Australia is experiencing its hottest summer ever recorded. A price on carbon was introduced in Australia in July last year. Does your party propose to abolish this effective legislation simply because it's not your policy?
Julie Bishop.
His first statement about what Tony Abbott claims is in fact not correct. Tony Abbott has said on a number of occasions, many, many times, that climate change is real and that we should give the planet the benefit of the doubt. And so he's not in fierce argument with scientists at all, as has been alleged. We don't believe that a carbon tax will, in fact, reduce Australia's contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, on the government's own modelling, greenhouse gas emissions in Australia will rise under a carbon tax. So it doesn't have the environmental outcome that, under the government's own modelling, that the environmentalists claim. We also don't believe that putting a tax on businesses is going to have this outcome. What it will do is send jobs, manufacturing overseas to countries where they don't have a carbon tax. So we miss out on the jobs, we miss out on the manufacturing, and it doesn't have the environmental outcome. So yes, we will repeal the carbon tax.
Christine Milne.
Well, no, they won't repeal the carbon tax.
Oh, yes, we will.
The issue here is that right today, the Climate Commission has come out saying that extreme weather events are climate related. The intensity of extreme weather events has increased because of climate change, and the whole of Australia has seen that this summer. In fact, we've seen 8 of the 21 instances in the last 100 years where we've had a national average more than 39 degrees happen this year alone. So we actually have to reduce emissions, and what we have found is that Australia's emissions have come down 8.5% since carbon pricing has been introduced. It is essential that we not only reduce our emissions, but we actually go much faster. And that's the benefit of having a market-based mechanism that we've put in place. And the problem with direct action is that if it ever achieved 5%, which I don't believe it will, since 60% of it's soil carbon and there's no methodology for that as it stands, but it can't be scaled up. So Tony Abbott doesn't take climate change seriously, he doesn't take the science seriously. If you did, then you would be scared by what's happening and you would be moving to go faster, not try and slow it down. And the Greens in the Senate will stand there and not repeal the clean energy package, because I want that $10 billion to go into renewable energy around Australia and into energy efficiency. And as for the jobs, let me tell you, China is moving on this with some of their pilot emissions systems larger than the whole of what Australia is proposing. The US is moving in some states. We are now moving globally to a treaty in 2015, and Australia will be trading the possibilities that are there in the low carbon, zero carbon economy. That's where the new technology, where the excitement is, not in old coal-fired technology.
In the meantime, you're driving up electricity costs.
I just want to go to Russell and Cody. I want to hear from the other panellists.
So I agree with one thing Christine said, and that is you need market mechanisms. And the best market mechanism there is the power of the people, the voice of the people, the choice of the people. A tax is not the best market mechanism. And we can see that every day in our business. For instance, LED TVs are much more popular than LCD TVs because they use less power. We work very, very hard to make our TVs more energy efficient because that's what the customers want. We've seen the popularity of electric cars rise because that's what customers want. We were the first company in Australia to run a 100% paperless office because that's what the customers want. So that is the market mechanism that works.
So what about an emissions trading scheme, which is also a market mechanism? Would you support that?
I don't know enough about it to tell you whether I support it or not, but I'd probably, I don't know what Julie's view on it is, but I don't know enough of something like that.
Well, we do have a policy to tackle climate change. It's our direct action plan, and it takes into account a whole range of issues that we believe government can assist business with. Rather than punishing, it's providing incentives.
Okay.
See, what's happening currently is putting
I'm going to actually give the Minister a chance to respond to this question as well.
Electricity costs going up and up and not having the environmental outcome. Just finished.
Okay,
in terms of what the Libs say on climate change, half of... even if you accept that the Leader of the Opposition's a weather vane on the topic, sometimes he likes it, sometimes he doesn't. And I think that's being generous. But what I also know is that they've got a pretty right-wing backbench. You've got some people out there who just don't accept it. So I'm not sure that any discussion that they're going to act on climate change you can take too seriously when you look at their pronouncements and what they say in their own ranks. In terms of the rest of the world moving towards it, the rest of the world is moving towards acting on climate change. The government did want to move to an emissions trading system. We couldn't get the numbers in the Senate. That's a matter of historical record.
The Greens didn't vote for you.
Yeah, well, you guys weren't there either.
No, but I'm just... we don't have the numbers in the Senate.
No, but you could have helped. Anyway.
Bill Shorten, very briefly, was it a political error to spend so long with the actual carbon tax before moving to an emissions trading scheme? Because if you could theoretically, you pick this 3-year period, you could have picked a 1-year period, you'd have an emissions trading scheme now.
Well,
so was that a political error not doing that?
I think the error was the Senate to vote down our first scheme. No. But I accept that's a matter of record. Christine's got one view, Julie's got another. I'm stuck in the middle. But what I would say about us, we picked a 3-year period for a fixed price. Most of heavy industry, and we talk to them as much as anyone else, the private sector accepts that we're going to have to do something on climate change. You have to price carbon emissions. Like, the game's over, but we've just got these holdouts, a bit like that sort of Japanese lieutenant in the hills in the Philippines who was caught 30 years after the end of World War II. You know, these guys are holding out, but when they ever act on it, they will agree. You know, it's over.
Just a brief comment from Tim Ferguson there.
It's another behavioural tax. I don't understand why you ask us to vote for parties that really just raise taxes to push us in one direction or not another. There's a behavioural tax on cask wine. I love cask wine. Cask wine is actually really very tasty. I endorse cask wine, but you raise the price of it and by nowhere near enough to actually stop me buying it because I like the stuff. Raise it by $100 and then maybe I'll change. If you're going to raise the price of electricity for every home in the country, then raise it by 1,000%, because 5% here, 10% there, who cares? We just have to shoulder the burden while you people score points against each other in a mud fight.
OK, we're going to move on. We've got another question. We're running out of time, so we'll quickly go to a last couple of questions. One's from David Beaver.
Yes, this is for Julie Bishop. As a predominantly Liberal voter, many people expect that I'd vote for support Malcolm Turnbull to be the next Liberal Party leader after Tony Abbott decides to step aside or retire. The fact is, though, I don't, because I really don't trust him or like him. I'd rather you take over from Abbott once he goes. Please tell me, will we see a Julie Bishop first female Liberal Party leader and second female PM with Joe Hockey as your deputy?
Whoa. What I hope you'll see is Julie Bishop as the first female Foreign Minister of Australia. That is my aspiration. That's what I hope will happen. But thank you.
Like Hillary Clinton with no other ambitions.
More like Condoleezza Rice. More like Condoleezza Rice or Madeleine Albright.
I've got to ask you this, though. Watching Tony Abbott and his kind of fountain of youth mentality and his physical regime, do you think he will ever step aside if he actually does become Prime Minister? Do you think he might be targeting the Menzies era?
I think that Tony is an extraordinarily good role model for older gentlemen. He's very fit, he keeps very healthy, and I think that's a great role model for us all. I try and keep up with him. I've got a little exercise regime, but it's nothing like Tony.
He's so thanking you for referring to him as an older gentleman.
Anybody over 50, I guess, would be in that category. But Tony's...
I've had a hard life, but I'm still under 50. No, listen, I can go with Julie on the point that I'm happy to have Tony Abbott as Australia's #1 personal trainer. It just worries me that... But just making him Prime Minister of Australia is our challenge, and it's not the one I get so excited about.
I think Tony's going to make a great Prime Minister.
I'm going to jump in. We've got time for one last question. It's a video. It's from Lisa Rufus in Brisbane.
According to me, comedians like Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert and Bill Maher are more trusted as news sources than the traditional news channels, and if I was an American, I'd vote for either one of them for president in a heartbeat. There's truth in art, and comedy in particular has a way of seeking out truth, so why don't we encourage more comedians to run for parliament?
Yes, she did say according to me.
I'm going to send a cheque. Thank you. The reason why those comedians are trusted is because comedy is all about dealing with, a broadly accepted truth. And I am going to run for the Senate, and not really to get elected. It's just that I need someone to vote for, and I've run out of options.
Hey, Tim, you did see what happened in Italy, though. I mean, a comedian now basically holds the reins of power in the Italian government. So, look, anything's possible, isn't it?
That's my nightmare. But there are so many people who are looking at either informally voting or donkey votes. And, I should say, at high school, I had the rather cruel nickname of Donkey Boy, but...
really.
We're really not going to ask you why.
It's a long story, Tony, but I don't have any policies and I won't make any promises. There will be no promises under a candidacy I leave. But if you do have a policy, you know, come to the Melbourne Comedy Festival, see my show, and then give me one. There'll be a little box outside the front of the venue, and you can pop it in there, and I'll say it.
Julie Bishop.
Tony, you mentioned that in the recent Italian elections there was a comedian who had stood for Parliament, although he's not in the Parliament. But today I was at the Australian-Indonesian dialogue here in Sydney, and a comedian in Indonesia has been elected to the Parliament in Megawati's party. And so this, I think, is a trend happening around the world.
You've got Corey Bernardi.
How long have you been waiting? How long have you been waiting to use that one? But I think that Tim's going to find, should he be elected, Tim's going to find that humour for politicians is an area fraught with danger. Now, I'm the first to say the tip for young players as politicians is take issues seriously, don't take yourself too seriously. But when you try and use humour as a politician, as poor Mark Butler found the other day, it sometimes falls on very shaky ground.
Ruslan Kogan, what do you think?
I think that, look, comedians, they generally see social interactions on a different level to everyone else. That's why they're able to joke about it. They understand everything going on. So you could see why, you know, they can please a crowd and get into it. But I also agree with what Julie said as well, that jokes aside, yes, you can crack a few funny jokes and you can entertain a crowd. Running a country is serious business. And if you're going about it saying something like, yeah, I'm going to run for it because I need someone to vote, but I have no policies, like, I laugh, that's a really funny joke. But
damn serious too.
Bottom line is, we've got a country to run and it's the best country in the world and we need to do a good job at it.
So I can't count on your vote.
Look, the best comedy works because it's really honest. And when you see good comedians stand up there, I mean, Rod Quantock did a fantastic show on climate change, for example, because he was totally honest out there about what needs to be said. But in politics, it's really about integrity and authenticity. You've got to be true to who you are, to the policies that you take to the election, and you've got to stand up for what you believe in. And I think that that's the serious thing, as you've just said, all jokes aside. Politics is about the vision for the future and working hard for it, and it needs more than just a laugh. But a laugh's important.
Bill Shorten.
Oh, I think politics can lighten up a bit. I look at some of the presentations people do from all sides of politics, and yeah, I think humour has got a way of explaining things. It's accessible to people. So I feel under pressure to crack a joke here.
No, please don't.
Let's shorten
anyway, so I don't mind.
Let's shorten the bill.
That's very good. Shorten the bills.
Okay.
Yeah, I got that.
Some might say, though, that there's too much comedy going on in politics and none of it's intended. Yeah, comedy's good. I like Tim, though. Like, you know, in the Senate, when you've got to fill out a Senate ballot paper, if you're not following a party ticket, there's so many candidates you don't know. So I reckon, Tim, just come and join Labor, OK? We'll run you.
Yeah. Because you haven't got any policies either.
If you need to get your costings and you don't have any, go to the opposition. They still don't have any.
Too late, mate.
OK, I'm sorry.
Too late.
She got the best one-liner. That's all we've got time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Ruslan Kogan, Christine Milne, Bill Shorten, Julie Bishop, Tim Ferguson. OK. All right, getting serious again. Next week, Q&A will be holding the first of a series of election policy debates we plan to bring you between now and September. First up will be the education debate with the Minister for School Education and Youth, Peter Garrett, going head-to-head with the Shadow Minister for Education and Training, Christopher Pyne. According to the pollsters, education is a vote-deciding issue. We're bringing together the men who want to shape our future education policies to answer your questions. So please join us for Q&A, the education debate, next Monday. Until then, good night.
If you'd like to join the Q&A audience and ask a question, register now at abc.net.au/Q&A or call the number on your screen.